June 23, 1945, Camp Number 7, Guam. Lieutenant Fumiko Nakamura stood motionless in the mess hall doorway, her hand gripping the wooden frame so tightly her knuckles whitened. Before her, arranged on simple tables with the casual abundance of a peacetime market, lay produce she hadn't seen in over 2 years. Carrots with their green tops still attached, tomatoes red and firm, not the shriveled specimens she remembered from Saipan. Lettuce so fresh, it still glistened with water droplets. Cucumbers, radishes, potatoes that weren't sprouting or soft with rot. The Imperial Japanese Army nurse had survived the fall of Saipan, witnessed the mass civilian suicides at Marpi Point, endured 3 weeks hiding in caves eating grass and insects, and finally surrendered with 14 other female medical personnel on June 2nd, expecting execution or worse. Instead, American Marines had given her water, treated her infected wounds, and transported her to this POW facility on Guam. Now, 21 days into captivity, she stood paralyzed by vegetables. Behind Nakamura, Private First Class Keiko Yamamoto, a civilian telephone operator conscripted into military service on Saipan, began crying silently. Not the violent sobs of grief Nakamura had heard countless times in the caves, but the quiet tears of cognitive dissonance of witnessing something that contradicted every truth she had been taught about American barbarity and Japanese superiority. The American sergeant supervising the mess hall, a woman from the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, gestured toward the vegetables with what appeared to be confusion at their reaction. "Fresh produce came in yesterday from California," she explained in simple English, which Nakamura understood from her pre-war education. "We get shipments twice weekly. Take what you want, there's plenty." Plenty. The word hung in the air like an impossible promise. In Japan, even before the war, fresh vegetables had been a luxury for many. During the war, they had become memories. On Saipan, toward the end, they had been fantasies that tormented starving dreams. Nakamura stepped forward slowly, reaching out to touch a tomato as if it might disappear. It was real, solid, cool from refrigeration, another impossibility. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. The weight of it, perhaps half a pound, represented more fresh food than she had consumed in the final 2 months on Saipan. What Lieutenant Nakamura didn't know, what none of the Japanese prisoners at Camp 7 could have imagined, was that these vegetables represented not kindness or special treatment, but routine American military logistics. The tomatoes had been picked in California's Central Valley 4 days earlier, trucked to San Francisco, loaded onto refrigerated cargo ships, and transported 5,800 miles across the Pacific. This single weekly shipment to Guam contained more fresh produce than the entire Japanese garrison on Saipan had received in the final year of the island's defense. The mathematics of abundance were about to demolish every assumption these women held about their nation's strength and their enemy's capacity. To understand the psychological earthquake that fresh vegetables triggered in Japanese prisoners requires understanding the food situation in Japan and its empire by 1945. The Imperial Japanese Army had always operated on the principle of living off the land, with minimal logistics infrastructure. This philosophy, derived from the samurai tradition and codified in the Senjin-kun military code, emphasized spiritual strength over material preparation. Soldiers were expected to endure hardship without complaint. The policy had a more practical foundation in Japan's inability to match American logistics capacity, dressed up as virtue. By 1943, Japan's food situation had become desperate. The rice harvest that year fell 30% below normal due to labor shortages and fertilizer scarcity. American submarines were systematically destroying Japanese merchant shipping, cutting off food imports from conquered territories. The government implemented increasingly strict rationing. Adults in Tokyo received 330 grams of rice daily when available, supplemented with barley, sweet potatoes, and whatever could be grown in improvised urban gardens. Fresh vegetables became luxuries. Protein sources dwindled to occasional small portions of fish. For military personnel stationed on isolated Pacific islands, conditions were far worse. Saipan, where Nakamura and most of the Camp 7 prisoners had served, had been cut off from supply since February 1944. The 31,000 Japanese troops and 25,000 civilians on the island were left to survive on whatever they could produce or scavenge. Agricultural efforts produced minimal results in soil better suited for sugarcane. Fishing was dangerous and unproductive. By June 1944, when American forces invaded, rations had been cut to bare subsistence levels. Medical personnel like Nakamura received slightly better rations than combat troops, but that meant 200 grams of rice daily with occasional vegetables, seaweed, and almost no protein. The final weeks before Saipan's fall saw complete breakdown of food distribution. Combat troops received priority for the dwindling supplies. Civilians and non-combat personnel starved. Nakamura's medical unit had treated dozens of patients for beriberi, scurvy, and simple starvation. She herself had lost over 30 pounds from her already slight frame. The female medical personnel, 26 nurses and orderlies initially, had taken to eating grass, tree bark, insects, anything to survive. By the time of surrender, 19 of them had died, most from malnutrition-related illness rather than combat. The contrast with American logistics on Guam was so extreme, it seemed like propaganda, yet it was undeniably real. The United States military had constructed on Guam what amounted to a floating extension of American agricultural abundance. Refrigerated cargo ships transported fresh produce from California twice weekly. Cold storage facilities on the island maintained produce quality. Distribution networks ensured that even POW camps received fresh vegetables as part of standard rations. This wasn't generosity toward enemies, it was routine American logistics applied to military operations. The scale of American food logistics in the Pacific defied Japanese comprehension. By mid-1945, American forces were consuming 20,000 tons of supplies daily across the Pacific Theater, including 2,500 tons of food. Fresh produce represented a significant portion of this because American military doctors had determined that fresh vegetables reduced disease and improved morale. The mathematics were straightforward. Healthy soldiers fought better. Fresh food kept soldiers healthy. Therefore, the logistics system would deliver fresh food, even across thousands of miles of ocean. The refrigerated cargo ships that brought vegetables to Guam were themselves monuments to American industrial capacity. Each vessel, part of the fleet of over 300 refrigerated ships built during the war, could carry 500,000 cubic feet of refrigerated cargo. They were essentially floating warehouses with refrigeration systems that maintained temperatures just above freezing. Japan had built no such vessels during the war, depending instead on conventional cargo ships that couldn't preserve fresh food over long voyages. This single technological gap meant American troops ate fresh food while Japanese forces starved. Lieutenant Nakamura's transformation began that first evening when she actually ate fresh vegetables. The mess hall served a salad with lettuce, tomatoes, and cucumbers. There was butter for bread. Fresh fruit, apples from Washington State, appeared as dessert. The 15 Japanese female POWs at Camp 7 ate in near silence, tears streaming down several faces. Some ate slowly, savoring each bite. Others ate rapidly, as if the food might vanish. Private Yamamoto vomited after eating too quickly, her shrunken stomach unable to handle the volume and richness. Over the following days, as their bodies adjusted to adequate nutrition, the psychological impact deepened. These women had been told repeatedly that America was a nation of decadent weaklings, soft from luxury, incapable of sustaining military operations far from home. They had been assured that Japanese spiritual strength would overcome American material advantage. The propaganda had been relentless and comprehensive. American soldiers, they were told, would break under hardship that Japanese forces endured without complaint. Yet here, 5,800 miles from California, prisoners of war were eating fresh vegetables flown and shipped across an ocean. The Americans hadn't just sustained military operations far from home, they had sustained them with a level of logistics sophistication that made Japanese military supply look primitive. The implications were inescapable. If America could deliver fresh tomatoes to Guam twice weekly, what else could they deliver? How many ships did they have? How many trucks? How much of everything? Of Corporal Michiko Tanaka, a 23-year-old surgical nurse captured on Saipan, began keeping a secret diary in early July. Her entries, preserved after the war and translated for U.S. military intelligence studies, provide remarkable insight into the psychological transformation. July 3, 1945. Today they served fresh corn. I had not seen corn on the cob since I was a child in Hokkaido. The Americans grow so much they feed it even to prisoners. In the hospital on Saipan, we had 3 surgical instruments for 80 wounded. Here, the American infirmary has equipment I have only seen in photographs of Tokyo University Hospital. We were told they were barbarous and primitive. They are neither. July 8, 1945. I have gained 4 kilograms since capture. My uniform from Saipan hangs on me like a tent now, but I was skeletal then. Yamamoto-san can no longer count her ribs. The Americans seem puzzled by our gratitude for food they consider ordinary. Their guards eat the same meals we receive. This is not special treatment, but their normal standard. How did we believe we could defeat a nation that feeds its soldiers and prisoners equally well? July 15, 1945. The Americans brought ice cream yesterday. Frozen cream with sugar served in the middle of the Pacific Ocean where we starved for months. I watched the guards eat it casually, complaining it wasn't their preferred flavor. They have preferences among luxuries we forgot existed. Nakamura-san and I discussed this late into the night. If America can deliver ice cream to prisoners, what does this say about their industrial capacity, about our leaders' decisions? The female POWs at Camp 7 were not alone in their shocked recognition of American logistics superiority. Across the Pacific, Japanese prisoners were experiencing similar revelations. At camps in Hawaii, the Philippines, and the Marianas, captured Japanese personnel confronted the same cognitive dissonance. Male POWs who had been combat soldiers often initially dismissed good treatment as propaganda or softening techniques. The female prisoners, perhaps because they had worked in medical and support roles where logistics mattered critically, grasped the implications more quickly. Lieutenant Nakamura began asking questions of the American personnel. Her English, rusty from disuse but based on solid pre-war education, improved rapidly. She learned that the vegetables came from California, that refrigerated ships carried them, that cold storage facilities on Guam maintained them. She learned that similar supply chains delivered fresh food to every American base across the Pacific. She calculated distances, tonnages, and frequencies. The numbers were staggering. In August, American authorities began a careful re-education program for Japanese POWs. Female prisoners were shown documentary films about American agriculture and industry. The films were propaganda, certainly, but the underlying facts were accurate. One film showed the Central Valley of California, where much of their fresh produce originated. Endless fields of vegetables, harvested by mechanical equipment, processed in enormous facilities, distributed via refrigerated rail cars and trucks. The scale was incomprehensible. Private Yamamoto wrote in a letter to her family, eventually delivered after the war, "I thought the films must be exaggerated, made to deceive us. But then I remembered the vegetables. They are real. I eat them every day. If the vegetables are real, then the farms that grew them must be real. If the farms are that large, then perhaps all of it is true. Perhaps America is exactly as powerful as the films show. Perhaps we never had any chance of victory." The fresh vegetables became a daily reminder of Japanese military failure. Each meal served in the POW camp demonstrated American logistics capacity. The tomatoes that arrived fresh twice weekly proved American shipping and refrigeration infrastructure. The variety of produce, dozens of different vegetables rotating through menus, showed agricultural diversity. The consistent availability, regardless of season or weather, demonstrated system reliability that Japanese logistics had never achieved even in peacetime. By September 1945, with Japan's surrender announced, the full scope of American logistics capacity became clear to the POWs. They learned that the United States had been supplying forces across 2 oceans simultaneously while maintaining abundant civilian food supplies at home. They learned that American civilians during wartime had eaten better than Japanese civilians in peacetime. They learned that American POWs in Japanese camps had received starvation rations while Japanese POWs in American camps had gained weight. The psychological impact was profound and lasting. These women had grown up in Imperial Japan, educated in schools that taught Japanese racial and spiritual superiority. They had trained as military nurses, believing they served the divine emperor in a righteous cause against decadent enemies. The fresh vegetables and everything they represented had demolished that worldview more effectively than any propaganda could have. Corporal Tanaka's diary entry from September 5, 1945, captured the transformation. Nakamura-san asked me today what I will tell my family when I return to Japan. How do I explain what I have learned? Not just about American strength, but about our own weakness? We were told sacrifice was noble, that spiritual strength would overcome material disadvantage, but there is no nobility in needless starvation. There is no virtue in suffering that accomplishes nothing. The Americans did not defeat us through greater sacrifice, they defeated us through greater production. They buried us in ships, planes, bullets, and yes, fresh vegetables. While we praised our ability to endure hardship, they built systems that eliminated hardship. Which approach was wiser? The American authorities recognized the re-education potential of simple abundance. Camp 7's commanding officer, Major Ruth Hawkins of the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, understood that good treatment of female POWs would have lasting impact. Her reports to higher command noted the remarkable transformation she witnessed. The female Japanese prisoners arrived malnourished, traumatized, and deeply indoctrinated with beliefs about American barbarity. Within weeks, exposure to ordinary American military logistics shattered those beliefs more completely than any deliberate propaganda program could have achieved. They understand now that they fought an enemy whose routine logistics exceeded their maximum capabilities. The vegetable shipments continued through September and October as arrangements were made for repatriation. The female POWs at Camp 7 lived for 5 months in conditions that contradicted everything their pre-war indoctrination had taught them. They received medical care superior to what Japanese military hospitals had provided before the war. They ate food more abundant and varied than Japanese officers typically received. They observed American military organization, efficiency, and casual competence that made Japanese military operations look chaotic by comparison. In November 1945, the 15 surviving female Japanese POWs from Camp 7 were transferred to a repatriation center in Manila. There, they encountered hundreds of Japanese prisoners awaiting transport home. The women shared their experiences, particularly focusing on the food they had received. Some male prisoners initially dismissed their accounts as exaggeration or collaboration, but the women's physical condition, their weight gain, their recovery from injuries and malnutrition provided undeniable evidence. One conversation recorded by American intelligence officers monitoring the repatriation center captured the impact. A Japanese army captain challenged Corporal Tanaka. "You were deceived by American propaganda. They fed you well to make you betray Japanese values." Tanaka's response was calm and devastating. "I gained 15 kilograms in captivity. You lost 20 kilograms, fighting for victory." The Americans fed prisoners better than Japan fed soldiers. This is not propaganda, it is fact. Which nation valued its people more? Which nation had resources to waste on enemy prisoners? These questions answer themselves. The repatriation ships that carried Japanese prisoners home from the Philippines to Japan in December 1945 provided a final lesson in American logistics versus Japanese capacity. The U.S. Navy transport vessels, converted cargo ships with adequate sanitation, ventilation, and food supplies, stood in stark contrast to the Japanese transport vessels that had carried troops to Pacific Islands earlier in the war. Those ships had been overcrowded, unsanitary, and poorly supplied. Many prisoners aboard the American vessels noted the irony. They were traveling home in greater comfort than they had experienced traveling to war. Lieutenant Nakamura's ship arrived at Uraga, near Tokyo, on December 18, 1945. Japan had been devastated by American bombing and the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Food shortages were more severe than during the war. Nakamura's family in Tokyo had been reduced to subsisting on rationed rice, sweet potatoes, and whatever could be scrounged or grown in improvised gardens. Her first evening home, her mother served the best meal available, rice with pickled vegetables and a small piece of dried fish. The family ate quietly, grateful for what they had. Nakamura couldn't help comparing this meal to what she had eaten daily as a prisoner of war. She said nothing. How could she explain that she had eaten better as an American prisoner than her family had eaten while free in Japan? How could she tell them about fresh vegetables delivered twice weekly across 5,800 miles of ocean, about refrigerated cargo ships, about abundance so casual it seemed wasteful? The words would sound like either delusion or betrayal. Over the following months and years, the former female POWs from Camp 7 and similar facilities gradually shared their experiences. Some faced skepticism or accusations of collaboration. Others found audiences receptive to understanding how completely Japan had been outmatched. Their testimonies contributed to Japan's post-war reckoning with the causes of defeat and the reconstruction philosophy that would follow. Corporal Tanaka became a teacher in post-war Japan, eventually writing a memoir in 1967 that detailed her experiences. The book, titled Beyond Saipan, included extensive discussion of the food situation and what it revealed about the war. We were taught that material things mattered less than spiritual strength. This was a lie told by leaders who knew we lacked material resources and hoped spirit could compensate. It could not. American soldiers ate fresh vegetables while Japanese soldiers starved, not because Americans were more spiritual or less spiritual, but because they had built systems to deliver fresh vegetables across an ocean. They won the logistics war before the shooting war ever reached its conclusion. By the time I ate my first tomato in Camp 7, Japan had already lost. I simply hadn't known it yet. Lieutenant Nakamura worked for the Japanese Red Cross in the post-war period, eventually becoming an advocate for international humanitarian law. In a 1972 speech to nursing students, she reflected on her POW experience. I expected to die on Saipan. When I survived and became a prisoner, I expected brutality or execution. Instead, I received medical care and adequate food. This gap between expectation and reality forced me to question everything I had been taught. The fresh vegetables were a small thing perhaps, but they represented a larger truth. The Americans had not achieved victory through brutality or barbarism, but through organizational excellence and industrial capacity. They had built a military machine that could deliver fresh tomatoes to prisoners while simultaneously conducting global war. Understanding this distinction changed my life. The story of female Japanese POWs weeping over fresh vegetables became part of a broader narrative about the Pacific War's outcome. American veterans who had served as guards or administrators at POW camps often mentioned the shocked reactions of Japanese prisoners to routine American logistics. These stories appeared in memoirs, oral histories, and eventually academic studies of the Pacific War. Historians recognize them as evidence of the fundamental disparity between American and Japanese logistics capacity. Dr. Edward Dreyer, a military historian specializing in the Pacific War, wrote in his analysis of Japanese military logistics, "The Japanese Army's inability to adequately supply its forces, even before considering American interdiction, represented a critical strategic weakness. When Japanese personnel encountered American logistics firsthand, either as prisoners or in combat, the disparity shattered their indoctrination about Japanese superiority. Small details, like fresh vegetables in POW camps, often had disproportionate psychological impact because they were undeniable physical evidence of American capacity. The vegetables themselves, simple produce that most Americans took for granted, became symbols of the vast gulf between nations in industrial capacity. A tomato represented not just food, but the refrigerated ship that carried it, the truck that delivered it, the cold storage facility that preserved it, the agricultural system that grew it, and the logistics network that coordinated everything. Each fresh vegetable was evidence of American industrial civilization functioning at a level Japan had never achieved. By the 1950s, as Japan rebuilt with American assistance, the former POWs saw their wartime observations validated. The Japanese economic miracle depended partly on adopting American organizational and industrial methods. The logistics systems that had delivered fresh vegetables to POW camps became models for Japanese post-war supply chains. Refrigerated transport, cold storage infrastructure, efficient distribution networks all became standard in rebuilt Japan, enabling the country to develop first-world living standards. Private Yamamoto, who had wept at the sight of fresh carrots in June 1945, operated a successful produce distribution business in Yokohama by 1960. She employed many of the logistics principles she had observed in American POW camps. In a newspaper interview celebrating her business success, she made an unexpected connection. "I learned more about modern logistics as a prisoner of war than I ever learned in school or military service. The Americans showed us without meaning to how proper organization and adequate resources could achieve what we thought impossible. I built my business on those lessons. The fresh vegetables at Camp 7 had taught more than nutrition. They had demonstrated the decisive advantage of industrial logistics over spiritual determination. They had proven that wars between industrial nations were won by production capacity and organizational excellence, not by warrior codes or willingness to endure hardship. They had shown that American abundance was not propaganda, but physical reality that could be touched, tasted, and measured." In 2015, at a conference on World War II history in Tokyo, now 92-year-old Michiko Tanaka was interviewed about her POW experience. The interviewer asked what moment most changed her understanding of the war. Her answer remained consistent with what she had written 70 years earlier: "The first time I saw fresh tomatoes in the Camp 7 mess hall. Until that moment, I believed our propaganda about American weakness and Japanese superiority. The tomatoes proved we had been lied to comprehensively and completely. Everything that followed, all my later understanding about the war's causes and outcome, began with those tomatoes. They were not just food, they were truth." The 15 female Japanese POWs who had wept over fresh vegetables at Camp 7 in June 1945 had experienced in miniature what all of Japan would learn in defeat. The war had not been lost because Japanese soldiers lacked courage or determination. It had been lost because Japan had challenged an industrial superpower whose routine logistics exceeded Japan's maximum capabilities. The fresh vegetables delivered twice weekly to a single POW camp represented American capacity in microcosm, a logistics achievement Japan couldn't have matched even in peacetime, accomplished casually by America during global war. They had wept not just from the relief of ending starvation, though that was part of it. They had wept from recognition that everything they had been taught was false, that the sacrifices they had endured, the hardships they had celebrated as virtuous, had been unnecessary suffering in service of a doomed cause, that the fresh vegetables they had dreamed about on Saipan while eating grass and insects had been available all along, just not to them, not in an empire that had chosen conquest over caring for its people. The tomatoes and carrots and lettuce at Camp 7 had taught them the hardest lesson of the Pacific War. Japan had not been defeated by an enemy more willing to sacrifice. It had been defeated by an enemy who had built systems that made sacrifice unnecessary. The Americans had not won through greater endurance of hardship. They had won by creating abundance that eliminated hardship. This revelation, delivered in fresh produce twice weekly to a POW camp on Guam, completed the defeat that combat had begun. The women who had wept over vegetables in June 1945 understood something many Japanese military commanders never grasped. The war was lost not on the battlefield, but in the farms, factories and logistics networks that could deliver fresh tomatoes across an ocean to feed enemies while simultaneously crushing their homeland. When Lieutenant Fumiko Nakamura died peacefully in Tokyo in 2003 at age 84, her family found among her possessions a small watercolor painting she had made in 1946. It depicted the scene from her first morning at Camp 7, the mess hall tables laden with fresh vegetables, light streaming through windows, and in the foreground, a single perfect tomato. On the back, in her careful handwriting, she had written, June 23rd, 1945, the day I understood we had lost, and why. Never forget the cost of believing lies about our own superiority and our enemy's weakness. The truth is sometimes as simple as a tomato, and as devastating.